Chapter 16. Como de Florençal stood at Tarzan's side, his weapon ready to take issue with any who might question their presence here, but presently the end of his iron rod dropped to the floor and a broad smile overspread his features. Tarzan looked at him. "Who are they?" he demanded, "and why have they been killed?" "They are not dead," my friend replied Como de Florençal. "They are the nobles whose duty it is to prevent the use of wine. They are not dead, they are drunk." "But the blood beneath the head of this one at my feet," demanded the ape-man. "It is red wine, not blood," his companion assured him. Then Tarzan smiled. "They could not have chosen a better night for their orgy," he said. "Had they remained sober, the door through which we entered from the storeroom would have been securely fastened, I imagine." "Assuredly, and we would have had a sober guard of warriors to deal with in this chamber instead of 10 drunken nobles. We are very fortunate, Zuanthrol." He had scarcely ceased speaking when a door in the opposite side of the room swung open, revealing 2 warriors, who stepped immediately into the chamber. They eyed the 2 who faced them, and then glanced about the room at the inert forms of its other occupants. "What do you hear?" slaves demanded one of the newcomers. "Shesh, cautioned Tarzan, placing a finger to his lips. "Enter and close the door, lest others hear." "There is no one near to hear," snapped one of them, but they entered and he closed the door. "What is the meaning of this?" "That you are our prisoners," cried the ape-man, leaping past them and placing himself before the door, his iron rod in readiness. A sneer twisted the mouth of each of the 2 Veltopis Makushins as they whipped out their rapiers and leaped toward the ape-man, ignoring for the moment the Trohanadal Makushian, who, seizing upon the opportunity thus afforded him, threw aside his iron rod and snatched a rapier from the side of one of the drunken nobles, a substitution of weapons that would render Como de Florençal a dangerous opponent anywhere in Minuni, for there was no better swordsman among all the warlike clans of Trohanadal Makus, whose blades were famed throughout Minuni. Facing, with only an iron rod, 2 skilled swordsmen placed Tarzan of the Apes at a disadvantage that might have proved his undoing, had it not been for the presence of Como de Florençal, who, no sooner than he had appropriated a weapon, leaped forward and engaged one of the warriors. The other pressed Tarzan fiercely. "Your prisoner, a slave," he sneered as he lunged for his opponent, but though less skilled, perhaps, in swordplay than his antagonist, the Lord of the Jungle had not faced Bolgani and Numa for nothing. His movements were as lightning, his strength as great as before Zoanthrogo had reduced his stature. At the first onslaught of the warriors he had leaped to one side to avoid the thrust of a blade, and as much to his own astonishment as to theirs, what he had intended but for a nimble sidestep had carried him the length of the room, and then the man had been at him again, while the other was having his time well occupied with the Zitalosto of Trohanadal Makus. Twice Tarzan parried cuts with his cumbersome bar and then a thrust, but missed him by a hair's breadth, his sidestep coming but in the nick of time. It was a close call, for the man had lunged at his abdomen, a close call for Tarzan and death for his opponent, for as the point slipped harmlessly by him, the ape-man swung his rod upon the unguarded head of the Veltopis Makusian, and with a grunt the fellow slumped to the floor, his skull crushed to the bridge of his nose. Then Tarzan turned to aid Como de Florençal, but the son of Adendrohakis needed no aid. He had his man against the wall and was running him through the heart as Tarzan turned in their direction. As he fell, Como de Florençal swung toward the center of the room, and as his eye fell upon the ape-man, a smile crossed his face. "With an iron bar you bested a swordsman of Minuni," he cried. "I would not have believed it possible, and so I hastened to dispatch my man that I might come to your rescue before it was too late." Tarzan laughed. "I had the same thought in mind concerning you," he said. "And you could have well held it had I not been able to secure this rapier," Como de Florençal assured him. "But what now? We have again come much farther than it seems possible we can have. Naught will surprise me hereafter." "We are going to trade apparel with these 2 unfortunate gentlemen," said Tarzan, divesting himself of the green tunic as he spoke. Como de Florençal chuckled as he followed the example of his companion. "There are other peoples as great as the Minunians," he declared, "though until I met you, my friend, I should never have believed it." A few moments later the 2 stood garbed in the habiliments of Veltopis Makushian warriors, and Tarzan was slipping his green tunic upon the corpse of him whom he had slain. "But why are you doing that?" asked the prince. "Do likewise with yours, and you will see," presently Tarzan replied. Commodore Florencil did as the other bid him, and when the change had been completed, the ape-man threw one of the corpses across his shoulder and carried it into the storeroom, followed closely by Commodore Florencil with the other. Walking through the window embrasure to the edge of the shaft, Tarzan hurled his burden out into space, and reaching back took Commodore Florencil's from him and pitched it after the first. "If they do not examine them too closely," he said, "the ruse may serve to convince them that we died attempting to escape." As he spoke, he detached 2 of the hooks from the ladder down which they had clambered from the window of their dungeon and dropped them after the corpses. "These will lend color to the suggestion," he added, in explanation. Together they returned to the room where the drunken nobles lay, where Commodore Florencil began to rifle the fat money pouches of the unconscious men. "We shall need all of this that we can get, if we are to pose as Veltup's Macusian warriors for any length of time," he said. "I know these people by reputation, and that gold will buy many of the things that we may require: the blindness of guards and the complaisance of officials, if they do not guess too close to the truth concerning us." "That part of it you must attend to, Commodore Florencil," said Tarzan, "for I am unfamiliar with the ways of your people, but we may not remain here. These gentlemen have served us well, and themselves too, for their faithlessness and debauchery saved their lives, while the 2 who followed in sobriety the path of duty were destroyed." "Matters are strangely ordered," commented Commodore Florencil. "In Manuni as elsewhere," agreed Tarzan, leading the way to the door of the chamber, which they found opened into a corridor instead of into another chamber, as they had rather expected would be the fact at a point thus close to the central shaft. In silence they proceeded along the passageway, which, at this hour of the morning, was deserted. They passed lighted chambers, where men and women were sleeping peacefully in the glare of many candles. They saw a sentry asleep before the door of a noble's quarters. No one discovered them, and thus they passed down a series of inclined runways and along interminable corridors until they were far from that portion of the royal dome in which they had been incarcerated, and where it would be most natural for the search for them to commence in the event that the bodies they had hurled into the shaft were not immediately discovered, or were identified for what they really were, rather than for what the 2 fugitives had tried to make them appear. And now a white-tunicked slave was approaching them along the corridor. He passed without paying them any heed, and presently another and another appeared until the 2 realized that morning was approaching and the corridors would soon be filled with the inhabitants of the dome. "It will be best," said Commodore Florencil, "to find a hiding place until there are more people abroad. We shall be safer in a crowd than among just a few where we shall be the more noticeable." Nearly all the chambers they passed now were occupied by families, while those that were untenanted were without candles and therefore unsafe as hiding places for any length of time. But presently Commodore Florencil touched Tarzan's arm and pointed to a hieroglyphic beside a door they were approaching. "Just the place," he said. "What is it?" asked Tarzan, and as they came opposite the open door, "Why, it is filled with men. When they awake we shall be discovered." "But not recognized," returned the Trohanadal Macusian, "or at least the chances are slight that we shall be. This is a common chamber where any man may purchase lodgings overnight. Doubtless there are visitors from other domes, and strangers will not be particularly remarked on this account." He entered the room, followed by Tarzan. A white-tunicked slave approached them. "Candles for 2, demanded Commodore Florencil, handing the slave one of the smaller golden coins he had filched from the sleeping nobles. The fellow led them to a far corner of the room where there was plenty of space upon the floor, lit 2 candles and left them. A moment later they were stretched at full length, their faces toward the wall as a further protection against recognition, and were soon asleep. When Tarzan awoke, he saw that he and Commodore Florencil were the only remaining occupants of the chamber, other than the slave who had admitted them, and he awoke his companion, believing that they should do nothing that might even in a slight degree call more than ordinary attention to them. A bucket of water was brought them, and they performed their ablutions at a gutter which encircled the chamber, passing along the foot of each wall, as was the custom throughout Manuni, the waste water being carried away in pipes to the fields beyond the cities, where it was used for irrigating the crops. As all the water had to be carried into the domes and to the different levels in buckets, the amount used for ablutions was reduced to the minimum, the warrior and noble class getting the bulk of it, while the white-tunicked slaves depended principally upon the rivers, near which domes are always erected, for their baths. The green slaves fare the worst and suffer a real hardship through lack of bathing facilities, for the Manunians are a cleanly people, but they manage to alleviate their plight to some extent, where the quarry masters are more kindly disposed, by the use of stagnant seepage water that accumulates in every quarry at the lower levels, and which, not being fit for drinking purposes, may be used by the slaves for bathing when they are permitted the time to obtain it. Having washed, Tarzan and Comodo Florenzel passed out into the corridor, a broad thoroughfare of the domed city, where there were now passing two solid lines of humanity moving in opposite directions, the very numbers of the people proving their greatest safeguard against detection. Candles at frequent intervals diffused a brilliant light and purified the air. Open doorways revealed shops of various descriptions within which men and women were bartering for goods, and now Tarzan had his first real glimpse of Veltopis-Makushian life. The shops were all conducted by white-tunicked slaves, but slaves and warriors intermingled as customers, both sexes of each class being represented. It was Tarzan's first opportunity also to see the women of the warrior class outside their own homes. He had seen the Princess Janzara in the palace quarters, and through the doorways in various portions of the dome, he had seen other women of varying stations in life, but these were the first that he had seen abroad at close hand. Their faces were painted deep vermilion, their ears blue, and their apparel so arranged that the left leg and left arm were bare, though if even so much as the right ankle or wrist became uncovered, they hastily readjusted their garments to hide them, giving every evidence of confusion and embarrassment. As the ape-man watched them, he was reminded of fat dowagers he had seen at home, whose evening gowns left them naked to their kidneys, yet who would rather have died than to have exposed a knee. The front of the shops were covered with brilliant paintings, usually depicting the goods that were on sale, together with hieroglyphics describing the wares and advertising the name of the proprietor. One of these finally held the attention of the Trohanadal-Makusian, and he touched Tarzan's arm and pointed toward it. "A place where food is served," he said. "Let us eat." "Nothing would suit me better. I am famished," Tarzan assured him, and so the two entered the little shop where several customers were already sitting upon the floor with small benches pulled close to them, upon which food was being served in wooden dishes. Comodo Florenzel found a space near the rear of the shop, not far from a doorway leading into another chamber which was also a shop of a different character, not all the places of business being fortunately located upon a corridor, but having their entrances like this one, through another place of business. Having seated themselves and dragged a bench before them, they looked about while waiting to be served. It was evidently a poor shop, Comodo Florenzel told Tarzan, catering to the slave caste and the poorer warriors, of which there were several sitting at benches in different parts of the room. By their harness and apparel, which was worn and shabby, one might easily guess at their poverty. In the adjoining shop were several more of the same class of unfortunate warriors mending their own clothes with materials purchased from the poor shopkeeper. The meal was served by a slave in a white tunic of very cheap material, who was much surprised when payment for the meal and the service was offered in gold. "It is seldom," he said, "that warriors rich enough to possess gold come to our poor shop. Pieces of iron and bits of lead with much wooden money pass into my coffers, but rarely do I see gold. Once I did. And many of my customers were formerly of the richest of the city. Yonder see that tall man with the heavily wrinkled face. Once he was rich, the richest warrior in his dome. Look at him now, and see them in the next room performing menial services, men who once owned slaves so prosperous that they, in turn, hired other slaves to do the meaner duties for them. Victims, all of them, of the tax that El Camol Hago has placed upon industry. To be poor," he continued, "assures one an easier life than being rich, for the poor have no tax to pay, while those who work hard and accumulate property have only their labor for their effort, since the government takes all from them in taxes. Over there is a man who was very rich. He worked hard all his life and accumulated a vast fortune. For several years after El Camol Algo's new tax law was enforced, he struggled to earn enough to ensure that his income would be at least equal to his taxes and the cost of his living. But he found that it was impossible. He had one enemy, a man who had wronged him grievously. This man was very poor, and to him he gave all of what remained of his great fortune and his property. It was a terrible revenge, from being a contented man. This victim of another's spleen is now a haggard wreck, laboring unceasingly 18 hours each day in a futile attempt to ensure himself an income that will defray his taxes." Having finished their meal, the two fugitives returned to the corridor and continued their way downward through the dome toward the first level, keeping always to the more crowded corridors where detection seemed least likely. Now mounted men were more frequently encountered, and so rapidly and recklessly did the warriors ride along the narrow corridors that it was with difficulty that the pedestrians avoided being ridden down and trampled. And it seemed to Tarzan but little less than a miracle that any of them arrived at their destinations uninjured. Having at last come to the lowest level, They were engaged in searching for one of the 4 corridors that would lead them from the dome when their way was completely blocked by a great throng that had congregated at the intersection of 2 corridors. Those in the rear were stretching their necks to observe what was going on in the center of the gathering. Everyone was asking questions of his neighbor, but as yet no one upon the outskirts of the mob appeared to know what had occurred, until at last fragments of rumors filtered back to the farthermost. Tarzan and Comte de Florençal dared ask no questions, but they kept their ears open, and presently they were rewarded by overhearing repeated what seemed to be an authoritative account of what had transpired to cause this congestion. In answer to a question put by one of the throng, a fellow who was elbowing his way out from the center of the jam explained that those in front had halted to view the remains of 2 slaves who had been killed while trying to escape. They were locked in one of Zoanthrogo's slave cells at the very highest level. He told his questioner, and they tried to escape by climbing down an improvised ladder into the central shaft. Their ladder broke, and they were precipitated to the roof of the throne room, where their bodies, terribly mangled, were but just found. They are being carried out to the beasts. Now, one of them was a great loss to Zoanthrogo, as it was the slave Zoanthrol upon whom he was experimenting. "Ah," exclaimed a listener, "I saw them but yesterday." "You would not know them today," vouchsafed the informer, "so terribly are their faces disfigured." When the press of humanity had been relieved, Tarzan and Comte de Florençal continued their way, finding that the slaves' corridor lay just before them, and that it was down this avenue that the bodies of their victims of the previous night were being carried. What, asked the ape-man, did he mean by saying that they were being carried to the beasts? "It is the way in which we dispose of the bodies of slaves," replied the Trohanadal-Macusian. "They are carried to the edge of the jungle, where they are devoured by wild beasts. There are old and toothless lions near Trohanadal-Macus that subsist entirely upon slave meat. They are our scavengers, and so accustomed are they to being fed that they often come to meet the parties who bring out the corpses, pacing beside them, roaring and growling, until the spot is reached where the bodies are to be deposited." "You dispose of all your dead in this manner?" "Only the slave dead. The bodies of warriors and nobles are burned." "In a short time, then," continued Tarzan, "there will be no danger of there ever being a correct identification of those 2. He jerked his thumb along the corridor ahead, where the bodies of the 2 dead warriors were being bounced and jolted along upon the backs of diadettes. Chapter 17. "Where now?" demanded Comte de Florençal, as the 2 emerged from the mouth of the slaves' corridor and stood for a moment in the brilliant sunlight without. "Lead the way to the quarry where we were confined, and to the chamber in which we slept." "You must be weary of your brief liberty," remarked the Trohanadal-Macusian. "We are returning for Talaskar, as I promised," Tarzan reminded him. "I know," said the Zatalosto, "and I commend your loyalty and valor while deprecating your judgment. It will be impossible to rescue Talaskar. Were it otherwise, I should be the first to her assistance, but I know, and she knows, that for her escape is beyond hope. We will but succeed in throwing ourselves again into the hands of our masters." "Let us hope not," said Tarzan, "but if you feel, as you say, that our effort is foredoomed to failure, and that we shall but be recaptured, do not accompany me. My only real need of you is to guide me to the apartment where Talaskar is confined. If you can direct me to it, that is all I ask." "Think you I was attempting to evade the danger?" demanded Comte de Florençal. "No. Where you go, I will go. If you are captured, I shall be captured. We shall fail, but let us not separate. I am ready to go wherever you go." "Good," commented Tarzan. "Now lead the way to the quarry, and use your knowledge of things Manunian and your best wits to gain us entrance without too much talking." They passed, unchallenged, along the shaded walks between the domes of Veltopus Macus, and past the great parade where gorgeously caparisoned warriors were executing intricate evolutions with the nicest precision, and out beyond the domes along well-worn trails filled with toiling slaves and their haughty guards. Here they fell in beside the long column moving in the direction of the quarry in which they had been imprisoned, taking their places in the column of flanking guards, and thus they came to the entrance to the quarry. Perfunctorily the numbers of the slaves were taken, as they passed in, and entered in a great book, but to Tarzan's relief he noted that no attention was paid to the guards, who moved along beside their charges and down into the interior without being checked, or even counted. And with them went Comte de Florençal, Prince Royal of Trohanadal-Macus, and Tarzan of the Apes. Once inside the quarry and past the guard room, the two fell gradually to the rear of the column, so that when it turned into a level above that which they wished to reach, they were enabled to detach themselves from it without being noticed. To leave one column was but to join another, for there was no break in them, and often there were several moving abreast. But when they reached the 35th level and entered the tunnel leading to the chamber in which Talaskar was confined, they found themselves alone. Since there is little or no activity in these corridors leading to slave quarters except early in the morning when the men are led forth to their labors, and again at night when they are brought back. Before the door of the chamber they found a single warrior on guard. He was squatting on the floor of the tunnel leaning against the wall, but at their approach he rose and challenged them. Como de Florencil, who was in the lead, approached him and halted. "We have come for the slave girl, Talaskar," he said. Tarzan, who was just behind Como de Florencil, saw a sudden light leap to the eyes of the warrior. Was it recognition? "Who sent you?" demanded the warrior. "Her master Zoenthrohago," replied the Trohanadal Makusian. The expression upon the face of the warrior changed to one of cunning. "Go in and fetch her," he said, and unbolted the door, swinging it open. Como de Florencil dropped upon his hands and knees and crawled through the low aperture, but Tarzan stood where he was. "Go in," said the guard to him. "I will remain where I am," replied the ape-man. "It will not require two of us to find a single slave girl and fetch her to the corridor." For an instant the warrior hesitated, then he closed the door hurriedly and shot the heavy bolts. When he turned toward Tarzan again, who was now alone with him in the corridor, he turned with a naked sword in his hands, but he found Zoanthrol facing him with drawn rapier. "Surrender," cried the warrior. "I recognized you both instantly." "I thought as much," said Zoanthrol. "You are clever. With the exception of your eyes, they are fools, for they betray you." "But my sword is no fool," snapped the fellow, as he thrust viciously at the ape-man's breast. Lieutenant Paul d'Arnaut of the French Navy had been recognized as one of the cleverest swordsmen in the service, and to his friend Greystoke he had imparted a great measure of his skill during the many hours that the two had whiled away with the foils. And today Tarzan of the Apes breathed a prayer of gratitude to the far-distant friend whose careful training was, after many long years, to serve the ape-man in such good stead, for he soon realized that, though his antagonist was a master at the art of fence, he was not wholly outclassed, and to his skill was added his great strength and his agility. They had fought for but a minute or two when the Veltopus Makusian realized that he was facing no mean antagonist, and that he was laboring at a disadvantage in being unable to fall back when Tarzan rushed him, while his foeman had at his back the whole length of the tunnel. He tried then to force Tarzan back, but in this he failed, receiving a thrust in the shoulder for his pains, and then he commenced to call for help, and the ape-man realized that he must silence him, and that quickly, awaiting the opportunity that was presently afforded by a feint that evoked a wild lunge. Tarzan stepped quickly in and passed his sword through the heart of the Veltopus Makusian, and as he withdrew his blade from the body of his antagonist, he released the bolts that held the door and swung it open. Beyond it, white of face, crouched Como de Florencil, but as his eyes fell upon Tarzan and the body of the guard behind him, a smile curved his lips, and an instant later he was in the corridor beside his friend. "How did it happen?" he demanded. "He recognized us, but what of Talaskar? Is she not coming?" "She is not here. Kalfastaban took her away. He has purchased her from Zoanthrogo." Tarzan wheeled. "Rebolt the door and let us get out of here," he said. Como de Florencil closed and fastened the door. "Where now?" he asked. "To find Kalfastaban's quarters," replied the ape-man. Como de Florencil shrugged his shoulders and followed on behind his friend. They retraced their steps toward the surface without incident until they were opposite the 16th level, when a face was suddenly turned toward them from a column of slaves crossing the runway from one lateral to another. Just for an instant did the eyes of the slave meet those of Tarzan, and then the fellow had passed into the mouth of the lateral and disappeared. "We must hurry," whispered Tarzan to his companion. "Why now more than before?" demanded Como de Florencil. "Did you not see the fellow who just passed us and turned to look a second time at me?" "No, who was it?" "Garaftap," replied Tarzan. "Did he recognize you?" "As to that I cannot say, but he evidently found something familiar in my appearance. Let us hope that he did not place me, though I fear that he did." Then we must lose no time in getting out of here and out of Veltopismachus as well. They hurried on. Where are Kalfastaban's quarters? Asked Tarzan. I do not know. In Trohanadalmachus, warriors are detailed to the quarries for but short periods and do not transfer their quarters or their slaves during the time that they are there. I do not know the custom here. Kalfastoban may have finished his tour of duty in the quarries. On the other hand, it may be for a long period that they are detailed for that service, and his quarters may lie on the upper level of the quarry. We shall have to inquire. Soon after this, Tarzan stepped up to a warrior moving in the same direction as he and Commodore Florenzel. Where can I find Kalfastoban Ventel? He asked. They will tell you in the guard room, if it is any of your affair, he replied, shooting a quick glance at the two. I do not know. After that they passed the fellow, and at the first turn that hid them from him they increased their speed, for both were becoming suspicious of every least untoward incident, and their one wish now was to escape the quarry in safety. Nearing the entrance they attached themselves to a column of slaves toiling upward with their heavy burdens of rocks for the new dome, and with them they came to the guard room where the slaves were checked out. The officer and the clerks labored in a mechanical manner, and it appeared that it was to be as easy to leave the quarry as it had been to enter it, when the officer suddenly drew his brow together and commenced to count. How many slaves in this crew? He asked. 100, replied one of the warriors accompanying them. Then why 4 guards? He demanded. There are but 2 of us, rejoined the warrior. We are not with them, Commodore Florenzel spoke up quickly. What do you here? Demanded the officer. If we can see you alone, we can explain that, quickly replied the Trohanadalmacusian. The officer waved the crew of slaves upon their way and beckoned to Commodore Florenzel and Tarzan to follow him into an adjoining chamber, where they found a small anteroom in which the commander of the guard slept. Now, he said, let me see your passes. We have none, replied Commodore Florenzel. No passes. That will be difficult to explain, will it not? Not to one of your discrimination, replied the prince, accidentally jingling the golden coins in his pouch. We are in search of Kalfastoban. We understand that he owns a slave we wish to purchase, and not being able to obtain a pass to the quarry in the short time at our disposal, we ventured to come upon so simple an errand, without one. Could you direct us to Kalfastoban? Again he jingled the coins. I shall be delighted, replied the officer. His quarters are upon the 5th level of the royal dome upon the central corridor, and about midway between the king's corridor and the warrior's corridor. As he was relieved from duty in the quarry this very morning, I have no doubt but that you will find him there. We thank you, said Commodore Florenzel, leaning far back in the Manunian bow. And now, he added, as though it was an afterthought, if you will accept it, we shall be filled with gratitude if you will permit us to leave this slight token of our appreciation. And he drew a large gold coin from the pouch and proffered it to the officer. Rather than seem ungrateful, replied the officer, I must accept your gracious gift, with which I may alleviate the sufferings of the poor. May the shadow of disaster never fall upon you. The 3 then bowed, and Tarzan and Commodore Florenzel quitted the guard room, and a moment later were in the free, fresh air of the surface. Even in Manuni, breathed Tarzan. What was that? Asked his friend. I was just thinking of my simple, honest jungle and God's creatures that men call beasts. What should they call them? Demanded Commodore Florenzel. If judged by the standards that men themselves make, and fail to observe, they should be called demigods, replied the ape-man. I believe I get your point, laughed the other, but think. Had a lion guarded the entrance to this quarry, no gold piece would have let us pass. The frailties of man are not without their virtues. Because of them right has just triumphed over wrong, and bribery has worn the vestments of virtue. Returning to the royal dome, they passed around the east side of the structure to the north front, where lies the slaves' corridor in every dome. In quitting the dome, they had come from the warriors' corridor on the west, and they felt that it would be, but increasing the chances of detection were they to pass too often along the same route, where someone half recognizing them in one instance might do so fully after a second or third inspection. To reach the 5th level required but a few minutes after they had gained entrance to the dome. With every appearance of boldness they made their way toward the point in the central corridor at which the officer of the guard had told them they would find Kalfastoban's quarters, and perhaps Kalfastoban himself, but they were constantly on the alert. for both recognized that the greatest danger of detection lay through the chance that Kalfastaban might recall their features, as he of all Veltopis Macusians would be most apt to do so, since he had seen the most of them, or at least the most of Tarzan since he had donned the slave's green. They had reached a point about midway between the slave's corridor and the warrior's corridor when Commodore Florencil halted a young female slave and asked her where the quarters of Kalfastaban were located. "It is necessary to pass through the quarters of Hamadalban to reach those of Kalfastaban," replied the girl. "Go to the third entrance," and she pointed along the corridor in the direction they had been going. After they had left her, Tarzan asked Commodore Florencil if he thought there would be any difficulty in gaining entrance to Kalfastaban's quarters. "No," he replied, "the trouble will arise in knowing what to do after we get there." "We know what we have come for," replied the ape-man. "It is only necessary to carry out our design, removing all obstacles as they intervene." "Quite simple," laughed the prince. Tarzan was forced to smile, to be candid. He admitted, "I haven't the remotest idea what we are going to do after we get in there or after we get out either, if we are successful in finding Talaska and bringing her away with us. But that is not strange, since I know nothing, or practically nothing, or what conditions I may expect to confront me from moment to moment to moment in this strange city of a strange world. All that we can do is to do our best. We have come thus far much more easily than I expected. Perhaps we will go the whole distance with no greater friction, or we may stop within the next dozen steps forever." Pausing before the third entrance, they glanced in, discovering several women squatting upon the floor. 2 of them were of the warrior class, the others slaves of the white tunic. Commodore Florencil entered boldly. "These are the quarters of Hamadalban?" he asked. "They are," replied one of the women. "And Kalfastaban's are beyond?" "Yes." "And beyond Kalfastaban's?" inquired the Trohanadal Macusian. "A long gallery leads to the outer corridor. Upon this gallery open many chambers where live hundreds of people. I do not know them all. Whom do you seek?" "Palastokar," replied Commodore Florencil quickly, choosing the first name that presented itself to his memory. "I do not recall the name," said the woman, knitting her brows in thought. "But I shall find him now, thanks to you," said Commodore Florencil, "for my directions were to pass through the quarters of Hamadalban and Kalfastaban, when I should come upon a gallery into which opened the quarters of Palastokar, but perhaps if Kalfastaban is in, he will be able to direct me more exactly." "Kalfastaban has gone out with Hamadalban," replied the woman, "but I expect them back momentarily. If you will wait, they will soon be here." "Thank you," said Commodore Florencil hastily, "but I am sure that we shall have no trouble finding the quarters of Palastokar. May your candles burn long and brilliantly." And without waiting on further ceremony, he crossed the room and entered the quarters of Kalfastoban, into which Tarzan of the Apes followed at his heels. "I think, my friend," said the prince, "that we shall have to work rapidly." Tarzan glanced quickly around the first chamber that they entered. It was vacant. Several doors opened from it. They were all closed either with wooden doors or with hangings. The ape-man stepped quickly to the nearer and tried the latch. It gave, and he pushed the door ajar. All was darkness within. "Bring a candle, Commodore Florencil," he said. The prince brought 2 from their niches in the wall. "A storeroom," he said, as the rays of the candles illuminated the interior of the room. "Food and candles and raiment. Kalfastaban is no pauper. The tax collector has not ruined him yet." Tarzan, standing in the doorway of the storeroom, just behind Commodore Florencil, turned suddenly and looked out across the other chamber. He had heard voices in the quarters of Hamadalban beyond men's voices. One of them he recognized an instant later. It was the voice of Kalfastaban Vental. "Come," roared the bull voice of the Vental. "Come to my quarters, Hamadalban, and I will show you this new slave of mine." Tarzan pushed Commodore Florencil into the storeroom and, following him, closed the door. "Did you hear?" he whispered. Yes, it was Kalfastaban. The storeroom door was ornamented with a small, open grill covered with a hanging of some heavy stuff upon the inside. By drawing the hanging aside, the 2 could obtain a view of most of the interior of the outer chamber, and they could hear all that was said by the 2 men who now entered from Hamadalban's quarters. "I tell you, she is the greatest bargain I have ever seen," cried Kalfastoban. "But wait, I'll fetch her," and he stepped to another door, which he unlocked with a key. "Come out," he roared, flinging the door wide. With the haughty bearing of a queen, a girl stepped slowly into the larger room. No cowering civility of the slave here. Her chin was high, her gaze level. She glanced almost with contempt upon the Vental. And she was beautiful. It was Talisker. Como de Florenzel realized that he had never before appreciated how really beautiful was the little slave girl who had cooked for him. Calfastaban had given her a white tunic of good quality, which set off the olive of her skin and the rich blackness of her hair to better effect than had the cheap green thing that he had always seen her in. She belonged to Zoanthrohogo, Calfastaban explained to his friend, but I doubt that he ever saw her, else he never would have parted with her for the paltry sum I paid. You will take her for your own woman and raise her to our class, asked Hamadalban. No, replied Calfastaban, for then she would no longer be a slave and I could not sell her. Women are too expensive. I shall keep her for a time and then sell her while her value is still high. I should make a pretty profit from her. Tarzan's fingers closed tightly, as though upon the throat of an enemy, and the right hand of Como de Florenzel crept to the hilt of his rapier. A woman came from the quarters of Hamadalban and stood in the doorway. Two of the guards from the quarry are here with a green slave inquiring for Calfastaban, she said. Send them in, directed the Vental. A moment later the three entered. The slave was Karaftap. Ah, exclaimed Calfastaban, my good slave, Karaftap the best in the quarry. Why is he brought here? He says that he has information of great value, replied one of the guard, but he will divulge it to none but you. He has staked his life against the worth of his information, and the novand of the guard ordered him brought hither. What information have you, demanded Calfastaban? It is of great moment, cried Karaftap. Noble Zoanthrogo and even the king will be grateful for it, but were I to give it and have to return to the quarries, the other slaves would kill me. You were always good to me, Calfastaban Vental, and so I asked to be brought to you. For I know that if you promise that I shall be rewarded with the white tunic, if my service is considered worthy of it, I shall be safe. You know that I cannot do that, replied Calfastaban. But the king can, and if you intercede with him, he will not refuse. I can promise to intercede with the king in your behalf if the information you bring is of value, but that is all I can do. That is enough if you promise, said Karaftap. Very well, I promise. What do you know that the king would like to know? News travels fast in Veltopis, said Karaftap. And so it was that we in the quarry heard of the death of the two slaves, Aponato and Zoanthrol. Within a short time after their bodies were discovered. As both had been slaves of Zoanthrogo, we were all confined together in one chamber, and thus I knew them both well. Imagine then my surprise when, while crossing one of the main spirals with a crew of other slaves, I beheld both Zoanthrol and Aponato in the habiliments of warriors ascending toward the surface. What is the appearance of these two? Suddenly demanded one of the warriors who had accompanied Karaftap from the quarry. The slave described them as fully as he could. The same, cried the warrior. These very two stopped me upon the spiral and inquired the whereabouts of Calfastaban. A crowd of women and men had gathered in the doorway of Calfastaban's chamber, having been attracted by the presence of a green slave accompanied by members of the quarry guard. One of them was a young slave girl. I too was questioned by these very men, she exclaimed, only a short time since, and they asked me the same question. One of Hamadalban's women voiced a little scream. They passed through our quarters but a moment since, she cried, and entered Calfastaban's, but they asked not where lay the quarters of Calfastaban. The name they mentioned was unknown to me, a strange name. Palastokar, one of her companions, reminded her. Yes, Palastokar, and they said he had his quarters upon the gallery leading from Calfastaban's to the outer corridor. There is no one of such a name in the royal dome, said Calfastaban. It was but a ruse to enter my quarters. Or to pass through them, suggested one of the quarry guard. We must hurry after them, said the other. Keep Karaftap here until we return, Calfastaban, said the first guard, and also search your own quarters and those adjoining carefully. Come. And motioning to the other guard, he crossed the chamber and departed along the gallery that led to the outer corridor, followed not alone by his fellow but by Hamadalban and all the other men who had congregated in the chamber, leaving Calfastaban and Karaftap with the women in the Vental's quarters. Chapter 18. Calfastaban turned immediately to a search of the various chambers of his quarters, but Karaftap laid a restraining hand upon his arm. Wait, Ventil, he begged. If they be here, would it not be best to ensure their capture by fastening the doors leading from your quarters? A good thought, Karaftap replied Kalfastaban, and then we may take our time searching for them. Out of here, all you women, he cried, waving the females back into Hamadalban's quarters. A moment later, the two doors leading from the chamber to Hamadalban's quarters and the gallery were closed and locked. And now, master, suggested Karaftap, as there be two of them, would it not be well to supply me with a weapon? Kalfastaban smote his chest. A dozen such could Kalfastaban overcome alone, he cried, but for your own protection get you a sword from yonder room while I lock this proud she-cat in her cell again. As Kalfastaban followed Talaskar to the room in which she had been confined, Karaftap crossed to the door of the storeroom where the Ventil had told him he would find a weapon. The Ventil reached the door of the room just behind the girl and reaching out caught her by the arm. Not so fast, my pretty, he cried. A kiss before you leave me, but fret not. The moment we are sure that those villainous slaves are not within these rooms, I shall join you, so do not pine for your Kalfastoban. Talaskar wheeled and struck the Ventil in the face. Lay not your filthy hands upon me, beast, she cried, and struggled to free herself from his grasp. So ho. A cat, indeed, exclaimed the man, but he did not release her, and so they struggled until they disappeared from sight within the cell. And at the same moment Karaftap, the slave, laid his hand upon the latch of the storeroom door, and opening it stepped within. As he did so, steel fingers reached forth out of the darkness and closed upon his throat. He would have screamed in terror, but no sound could he force through his tight-closed throat. He struggled and struck at the thing that held him, a thing so powerful that he knew it could not be human, and then a low voice, cold and terrifying, whispered in his ear. Die, Karaftap, it said. Meet the fate that you deserve and that you well knew you deserved when you said that you dared not return to the quarters of the slaves of Zoanthrogo after betraying two of your number. Die, Karaftap, and know before you die that he whom you would have betrayed is your slayer. You search for Zoanthrol, and you have found him with the last word. The terrible fingers closed upon the man's neck. Spasmodically the slave struggled, fighting for air. Then the two hands that gripped him turned slowly in opposite directions, and the head of the traitor was twisted from his body. Throwing the corpse aside, Tarzan sprang into the main chamber of the Ventil's quarters and ran quickly toward the door of Talaska's cell, de Florencil but half a pace behind him. The door of the little room had been pushed to by the struggles of the couple within, and as Tarzan pushed it open he saw the girl in the clutches of the huge Ventil, who, evidently maddened by her resistance, had lost his temper completely and was attempting to rain blows upon her face, which she sought to ward off, clutching at his arms and hands. A heavy hand fell upon the shoulder of the Ventil. You seek us, a low voice whispered in his ear. Here we are. Kalfastaban released the girl and swung around, at the same time reaching for his sword. Facing him were the two slaves, and both were armed, though only Apanato had drawn his weapon. Zoanthrol, who held him, had not yet drawn. A dozen such could Kalfastaban overcome alone, quoted Tarzan. Here we are, braggart, and we are only two, but we cannot wait while you show us how mighty you be. We are sorry. Had you not molested this girl, I should merely have locked you in your quarters, from which you would soon have been released, but your brutality deserves but one punishment, death. Karaftap, screamed Kalfastaban. No longer was he a blusterer, deep-toned and swaggering. His voice was shrill with terror, and he shook in the hands of the ape-man. Karaftap, help, he cried. Karaftap is dead, said Tarzan. He died because he betrayed his fellows. You shall die because you were brutal to a defenseless slave girl. Run him through, de Florencil. We have no time to waste here. As the Trohandel Macusian withdrew his sword from the heart of Kalfastaban Ventil and the corpse slid to the floor of the cell, Talaska ran forward and fell at the feet of the ape-man. Zoanthrol and Apanato, she cried. Never did I think to see you again. What has happened? Why are you here? You have saved me, but now you will be lost. Fly, I know not where to you may fly, but go from here. Do not let them find you here. I cannot understand why you are here anyway. We are trying to escape, explained de Florencil, and Zoanthrol would not go without you. He searched the quarry for you and now the royal dome. He has performed the impossible, but he has found you. Why did you do this for me? Asked Talaskar, looking wonderingly at Tarzan. Because you were kind to me when I was brought to the chamber of Zoanthrogo's slaves, replied the ape-man, and because I promised that when the time for escape came we three should go together. He had lifted her to her feet and led her into the main chamber. Commodore Florencil stood a little aside, his eyes upon the floor. Tarzan glanced at him, and an expression of puzzlement came into the eyes of the ape-man, but whatever thought had caused it, he must have put quickly aside for the consideration of more pressing matters. Commodore Florencil, you know best what avenues of escape should be the least beset by the dangers of discovery, whether to go by way of Hamad Alban's quarters or through the gallery they mentioned. These are questions I cannot answer to my own satisfaction, and look. His eyes had been roving about the chamber. There is an opening in the ceiling. Where might that lead? It might lead almost anywhere or nowhere at all, replied the Trojana Dalmacusian. Many chambers have such openings. Sometimes they lead into small lofts that are not connected with any other chamber. Again, they lead into secret chambers, or even into corridors upon another level. There came a pounding upon the door leading into Hamad Alban's quarters, and a woman's voice called aloud, Kalfastoban. Open, she cried. There has come an entil from the quarry guard in search of Karaftap. The sentry at the entrance to the quarters of the slaves of Zoanthrogo has been found slain, and they wish to question Karaftap, believing that there is a conspiracy among the slaves. We must go by the gallery, whispered Commodore Florencil, stepping quickly to the door leading thereto. As he reached it, someone laid a hand upon the latch from the opposite side and attempted to open the door, which was locked. Kalfastoban, cried a voice from the gallery beyond. Let us in. The slaves went not this way. Come, open quickly. Tarzan of the Apes glanced quickly about. Upon his face was a half snarl, for once again was he the cornered beast. He measured the distance from the floor to the trap in the ceiling, and then with a little run, he sprang lightly upward. He had forgotten to what extent the reduction of his weight had affected his agility. He had hoped to reach a handhold upon the upper edge of the opening, but instead he shot entirely through it, alighting upon his feet in a dark chamber. Turning, he looked down at his friends below. Consternation was writ large upon the countenance of each, but at that he could not wonder. He was almost as much surprised himself. Is it too far for you to jump? He asked. Too far, they replied. He swung then head downward through the opening, catching the edge of the trap in the hollow of his knees. At the gallery door the knocking was becoming insistent, and now at that leading into the quarters of Hamad Alban a man's voice had supplanted that of the woman. The fellow was demanding entrance angrily. Open, he shouted. In the name of the king, open. Open yourself, shouted the fellow who had been hammering at the opposite door, thinking that the demand to open came from the interior of the chamber to which he sought admission. How can I open? Screamed back the other. The door is locked upon your side. It is not locked upon my side. It is locked upon yours, cried the other angrily. You lie, shouted he who sought entrance from Hamad Alban's quarters, and you will pay well when this is reported to the king. Tarzan swung, head downward, into the chamber, his hands extended toward his companions. Lift Talaskar to me. He directed Commodore Florencil, and as the other did so he grasped the girl's wrists and raised her as far as he could until she could seize upon a part of his leather harness and support herself alone without falling. Then he took another hold upon her, lower down, and lifted still higher, and in this way she managed to clamber into the chamber above. The angry warriors at the two doors were now evidently engaged in an attempt to batter their way into the chamber. Heavy blows were falling upon the substantial panels that threatened to splinter them at any moment. Fill your pouch with candles, Commodore Florencil, said Tarzan, and then jumped from my hands. I took all the candles I could carry while we were in the storeroom, replied the other. Brace yourself. I am going to jump. A panel splintered and bits of wood flew to the center of the floor from the door at the gallery, just as Tarzan seized the outstretched hands of Commodore Florencil, and an instant later. As both men kneeled in the darkness of the loft and looked down into the chamber below, the opposite door flew open and the 10 warriors who composed the entil burst in at the heels of their ventil. For an instant, they looked about in blank surprise, and then their attention was attracted by the pounding upon the other door. A smile crossed the face of the ventil as he stepped quickly to the gallery door and unlocked it. Angry warriors rushed in upon him, but when he had explained the misapprehension under which both parties had been striving for entrance to the chamber, they all joined in the laughter, albeit a trifle shamefacedly. But who was in here? Demanded the ventil who had brought the soldiers from the quarry. Kalfastoban and the green slave Karaftap proffered a woman belonging to Hamad Alban. They must be hiding, said a warrior. Search the quarters, commanded the ventil. "It will not take long to find one," said another warrior, pointing at the floor just inside the storeroom doorway. The others looked, and there they saw a human hand resting upon the floor. The fingers seemed frozen into the semblance of clutching claws. Mutely they proclaimed death. One of the warriors stepped quickly to the storeroom, opened the door, and dragged forth the body of Karaftap, to which the head was clinging by a shred of flesh. Even the warriors stepped back, aghast. They looked quickly around the chamber. "Both doors were barred upon the inside," said the Vental. "Whatever did this must still be here." "It could have been nothing human," whispered a woman who had followed them from the adjoining quarters. "Search carefully," said the Vental, and as he was a brave man, he went first into one chamber and then another. In the last one they found Kalfastoban, run through the heart. "It is time we got out of here if there is any way out," whispered Tarzan to Coma de Florencil. "One of them will espy this hole directly." Very cautiously the two men felt their way in opposite direction around the walls of the dark, stuffy loft. Deep dust, the dust of ages, rose about them, chokingly evidencing the fact that the room had not been used for years, perhaps for ages. Presently Coma de Florencil heard AHSST from the ape-man, who called them to him. "Come here, both of you. I have found something." "What have you found?" asked Talaskar, coming close. "An opening near the bottom of the wall," replied Tarzan. "It is large enough for a man to crawl through. Think you, Coma de Florencil, that it would be safe to light a candle?" "No, not now," replied the prince. "I will go without it," then announced the ape-man, "for we must see where this tunnel leads, if anywhere." He dropped upon his hands and knees then, and Talaskar, who had been standing next him, felt him move away. She could not see him, it was too dark in the gloomy loft. The two waited, but Zuanthrol did not return. They heard voices in the room below. They wondered if the searchers would soon investigate the loft, but really there was no need for apprehension. The searchers had determined to invest the place. It would be safer than crawling into that dark hole after an unknown thing that could tear the head from a man's body. When it came down, as come down it would have to, they would be prepared to destroy or capture it, but in the meantime they were content to wait. "What has become of him?" whispered Talaskar, anxiously. "You care very much for him, do you not?" asked Coma de Florencil. "Why should I not?" asked the girl. "You do, too, do you not?" "Yes," replied Coma de Florencil. "He is very wonderful," said the girl. "Yes," said Coma de Florencil. "I wish he would come back," said the girl. "Yes," said Coma de Florencil. As though in answer to their wish, they heard a low whistle from the depths of the tunnel into which Tarzan had crawled. "Come," whispered the ape-man. Talaskar first, they followed him, crawling upon hands and knees through a winding tunnel, feeling their way through the darkness, until at last a light flared before them, and they saw Zuanthrol lighting a candle in a small chamber. That was only just high enough to permit a tall man to sit erect within it. "I got this far," he said to them, "and as it offered a fair hiding place where we might have light without fear of discovery, I came back after you. Here we can stop a while in comparative comfort and safety until I can explore the tunnel further. From what I have been able to judge, it has never been used during the lifetime of any living Veltopis Mercusian, so there is little likelihood that anyone will think of looking here for us." "Do you think they will follow us?" asked Talaskar. "I think they will," replied Coma de Florencil, "and as we cannot go back, it will be better if we push on at once, as it is reasonable to assume that the opposite end of this tunnel opens into another chamber. Possibly there we shall find an avenue of escape." "You are right," Coma de Florencil agreed Tarzan. "Nothing can be gained by remaining here. I will go ahead, let Talaskar follow me, and you bring up the rear. If the place proves a blind alley, we shall be no worse off for having investigated it." Lighting their way this time with candles, the three crawled laboriously and painfully over the uneven rock floor of the tunnel, which turned often this way and that as though passing around chambers, until to their relief the passageway abruptly enlarged, both in width and height, so that now they could proceed in an erect position. The tunnel now dropped in a steep declivity to a lower level, and a moment later the three emerged into a small chamber, where Talaskar suddenly placed a hand upon Tarzan's arm, with a little intaking of her breath in a half-gasp. "What is that, Zuanthrol?" she whispered, pointing into the darkness ahead. Upon the floor at one side of the room a crouching figure was barely discernible close to the wall. "And that," exclaimed the girl, pointing to another portion of the room. The ape-man shook her hand from his arm and stepped quickly forward, his candle held high in his left hand, his right upon his sword. He came close to the crouching figure and bent to examine it. He laid his hand upon it, and it fell into a heap of dust. "What is it?" demanded the girl. "It was a man," replied Tarzan, "but it has been dead many years. It was chained to this wall. Even the chain has rusted away." "And the other two?" asked Talaskar. "There are several of them," said Commodore Florencil. "See, there and there." "At least they cannot detain us," said Tarzan, and moved on again across the chamber toward a doorway on the opposite side. "But they tell us something," possibly ventured Commodore Florencil. "What do they say?" asked the ape-man. "That this corridor connected with the quarters of a very powerful Veltopus Macusian," replied the prince. "So powerful was he that he might dispose of his enemies thus, without question, and it also tells us that all this happened long years ago." "The condition of the bodies told us that," said Tarzan. "Not entirely," replied Commodore Florencil. "The ants would have reduced them to that state in a short time. In past ages the dead were left within the domes, and the ants, who were then our scavengers, soon disposed of them. But the ants sometimes attacked the living. They grew from a nuisance to a menace. And then every precaution had to be taken to keep from attracting them. Also we fought them. There were great battles waged in Trohanadolmachus between the Manunians and the ants, and thousands of our warriors were devoured alive. And though we slew billions of ants, their queens could propagate faster than we could kill the sexless workers who attacked us with their soldiers. But at last we turned our attention to their nests. Here the carnage was terrific. But we succeeded in slaying their queens, and since then no ants have come into our domes. They live about us, but they fear us. However, we do not risk attracting them again by leaving our dead within the domes." "Then you believe that this corridor leads to the quarters of some great noble?" inquired Tarzan. "I believe that it once did. The ages bring change. Its end may now be walled up. The chamber to which it leads may have housed a king's son when these bones were quick. Today, it may be a barrack room for soldiers, or a stable for diedettes. About all that we know definitely about it," concluded Commodore Florencil, "is that it has not been used by man for a long time, and probably therefore is unknown to present-day Veltopus Macusians." Beyond the chamber of death the tunnel dropped rapidly to lower levels, entering at last a third chamber larger than either of the others. Upon the floor lay the bodies of many men. "These were not chained to the walls," remarked Tarzan. "No, they died fighting, as one may see by their naked swords and the position of their bones." As the three paused a moment to look about the chamber, there fell upon their ears the sound of a human voice. Chapter 19. As the days passed and Tarzan did not return to his home, his son became more and more apprehensive. Runners were sent to nearby villages, but each returned with the same report. No one had seen the big bwana. Korak dispatched messages then to the nearest telegraph inquiring from all the principal points in Africa where the ape-man might have made a landing if aught had been seen or heard of him, but always again were the answers in the negative. And at last, stripped to G-string and carrying naught but his primitive weapons, Korak the killer took the trail with a score of the swiftest and bravest of the Waziri in search of his father. Long and diligently they searched the jungle and the forest, often enlisting the friendly services of the villages near which they chanced to be carrying on their quest, until they had covered as with a fine-toothed comb a vast area of country, covered it as could have no other body of men. But for all their care and all their diligence they uncovered no single clue as to the fate or whereabouts of Tarzan of the Apes, and so, disheartened yet indefatigable, they searched on and on through tangled miles of steaming jungle or across rocky uplands as inhospitable as the stunted thorns that dotted them. And in the royal dome of El Comohago, Tagosto of Veltopus Marcus, three people halted in a rock-walled, hidden chamber and listened to a human voice that appeared to come to them out of the very rock of the walls surrounding them. Upon the floor about them lay the bones of long-dead men. About them rose the impalpable dust of ages. The girl pressed closer to Tarzan. "Who is it?" she whispered. Tarzan shook his head. "It is a woman's voice," said Commodore Florencil. The ape-man raised his candle high above his head and took a step closer to the left-hand wall. Then he stopped and pointed. The others looked in the direction indicated by Tarzan's finger and saw an opening in the wall a hewel or two above his head. Tarzan handed his candle to Commodore Florencil, removed his sword and laid it on the floor, and then sprang lightly for the opening. For a moment he clung to its edge, listening, and then he dropped back into the chamber. It is pitch black beyond, he said. Whoever owns that voice is in another chamber beyond that into which I was just looking. There was no human being in the next apartment. If it was absolutely dark, how could you know that? Demanded Commodore Florencil. Had there been anyone there, I should have smelled him, replied the ape-man. The others looked at him in astonishment. I am sure of it, said Tarzan, because I could plainly feel a draught sucking up from the chamber, through the aperture, and into this chamber. Had there been a human being there, his effluvium would have been carried directly to my nostrils. And you could have detected it, demanded Commodore Florencil. My friend, I can believe much of you, but not that. Tarzan smiled. I at least have the courage of my convictions, he said, for I am going over there and investigate. From the clearness with which the voice comes to us, I am certain that it comes through no solid wall. There must be an opening into the chamber where the woman is, and as we should investigate every possible avenue of escape. I shall investigate this. He stepped again toward the wall below the aperture. Oh, let us not separate, cried the girl. Where one goes, let us all go. Two swords are better than one, said Commodore Florencil, though his tone was only half-hearted. Very well, replied Tarzan. I will go first, and then you can pass Talaskar up to me. Commodore Florencil nodded. A minute or two later the three stood upon the opposite side of the wall. Their candle revealed a narrow passage that showed indications of much more recent use than those through which they had passed from the quarters of Calfastaban. The wall they had passed through to reach it was of stone, but that upon the opposite side was of studding and rough boards. This is a passage built along the side of a panelled room, whispered Commodore Florencil. The other side of these rough boards supports beautifully polished panels of brilliant woods or burnished metals. Then there should be a door, you think, opening from this passage into the adjoining chamber, asked Tarzan. A secret panel, more likely, he replied. They walked along the passage, listening intently. At first they had just been able to distinguish that the voice they heard was that of a woman, but now they heard the words. Had they let me have him was the first that they distinguished. Most glorious mistress, this would not have happened then, replied another female voice. Zoanthrohogo is a fool and deserves to die, but my illustrious father the king is a bigger fool, spoke the first voice. He will kill Zoanthrohogo, and with him the chance of discovering the secret of making our warriors giants. Had they let me buy this Zoanthrol, he would not have escaped. They thought that I would have killed him, but that was farthest from my intentions. What would you have done with him, wondrous princess? That is not for a slave to ask or know, snapped the mistress. For a time there was silence. That is the Princess Janzara speaking, whispered Tarzan to Commodore Florencil. It is the daughter of Elcamoel Hago, whom you would have captured and made your princess, but you would have had a handful. Is she as beautiful as they say, asked Commodore Florencil. She is very beautiful, but she is a devil. It would have been my duty to take her, said Commodore Florencil. Tarzan was silent. A plan was unfolding itself within his mind. The voice from beyond the partition spoke again. He was very wonderful, it said. Much more wonderful than our warriors, and then, after a silence, you may go, slave, and see to it that I am not disturbed before the sun stands midway between the women's corridor and the king's corridor. May your candles burn as deathlessly as your beauty, princess, said the slave, as she backed across the apartment. An instant later the three behind the paneling heard a door close. Tarzan crept stealthily along the passage, seeking the secret panel that connected with the apartment where the Princess Janzara lay composed for the night, but it was Talaskar who found it. Here, she whispered, and together the three examined the fastening. It was simple, and could evidently be opened from the opposite side by pressure upon a certain spot in the panel. Wait here, said Tarzan to his companions. I am going to fetch the Princess Janzara. If we cannot escape with her, we should be able to buy our liberty with such a hostage. Without waiting to discuss the advisability of his action with the others, Tarzan gently slid back the catch that held the panel and pushed it slightly ajar. Before him was the apartment of Janzara, a creation of gorgeous barbarity, in the center of which, upon a marble slab, the princess lay upon her back, a gigantic candle burning at her head and another at her feet. Regardless of the luxuriousness of their surroundings, of their wealth, or their positions in life, the Manunians never sleep upon a substance softer than a single thickness of fabric, which they throw upon the ground or upon wooden, stone, or marble sleeping slabs. depending upon their caste and their wealth. Leaving the panel open, the ape-man stepped quietly into the apartment and moved directly toward the princess, who lay with closed eyes, either already asleep or assiduously wooing Morpheus. He had crossed halfway to her cold couch when a sudden draught closed the panel with a noise that might well have awakened the dead. Instantly, the princess was on her feet and facing him. For a moment she stood in silence, gazing at him, and then she moved slowly toward him, the sinuous undulations of her graceful carriage suggesting to the lord of the jungle a similarity to the savage majesty of Saber, the lioness. "It is you," Zuanthrol breathed the princess. "You have come for me." "I have come for you, princess," replied the ape-man. "Make no outcry and no harm will befall you." "I will make no outcry," whispered Janzara, as with half-closed lids she glided to him and threw her arms about his neck. Tarzan drew back and gently disengaged himself. "You do not understand, princess," he told her. "You are my prisoner. You are coming with me." "Yes," she breathed, "I am your prisoner, but it is you who do not understand. I love you. It is my right to choose whatever slave I will to be my prince. I have chosen you." Tarzan shook his head impatiently. "You do not love me," he said. "I am sorry that you think you do, for I do not love you. I have no time to waste. Come," and he stepped closer to take her by the wrist. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you mad?" she demanded. "Or can it be that you do not know who I am?" "You are Janzara, daughter of Elkamolahago," replied Tarzan. "I know well who you are." "And you dare to spurn my love?" She was breathing heavily, her breasts rising and falling to the tumultuous urge of her emotions. "It is no question of love between us," replied the ape-man. "To me it is only a question of liberty and life for myself and my companions." "You love another question, Janzara." "Yes," Tarzan told her. "Who is she?" demanded the princess. "Will you come quietly, or shall I be compelled to carry you away by force?" asked the ape-man, ignoring her question. For a moment the woman stood silently before him, her every muscle tensed, her dark eyes two blazing wells of fire, and then slowly her expression changed. Her face softened and she stretched one hand toward him. "I will help you, Zuanthrol," she said. "I will help you to escape. Because I love you, I shall do this. Come, follow me." She turned and moved softly across the apartment. "But my companions," said the ape-man. "I cannot go without them." "Where are they?" He did not tell her, for as yet he was none too sure of her motives. "Show me the way," he said, "and I can return for them." "Yes," she replied, "I will show you, and then perhaps you will love me better than you love the other." In the passage behind the paneling, Talaskar and Coma de Florencel awaited the outcome of Tarzan's venture. Distinctly to their ears came every word of the conversation between the ape-man and the princess. "He loves you," said Coma de Florencel. "You see, he loves you." "I see nothing of the kind," returned Talaskar. "Because he does not love the Princess Janzara is no proof that he loves me." "But he does love you, and you love him. I have seen it since first he came. Would that he were not my friend, for then I might run him through." "Why would you run him through? Because he loves me if he does," demanded the girl. "Am I so low that you would rather see your friend dead than mated with me?" He hesitated. "I cannot tell you what I mean." The girl laughed and then suddenly sobered. "She is leading him from her apartment. We had better follow." As Talaska laid her fingers upon the spring that actuated the lock holding the panel in place, Janzara led Tarzan across her chamber toward a doorway in one of the side walls, not the doorway through which her slave had departed. "Follow me," whispered the princess, "and you will see what the love of Janzara means." Tarzan, not entirely assured of her intentions, followed her warily. "You are afraid," she said. "You do not trust me. Well, come here then and look yourself into this chamber before you enter." Coma de Florencel and Talaskar had but just stepped into the apartment when Tarzan approached the door to one side of which Janzara stood. They saw the floor give suddenly beneath his feet, and an instant later Zuanthrol had disappeared. As he shot down a polished chute, he heard a wild laugh from Janzara following him into the darkness of the unknown. Coma de Florencel and Talaskar leaped quickly across the chamber, but too late. The floor that had given beneath Tarzan's feet had slipped quietly back into place. Janzara stood above the spot, trembling with anger and staring down at the place where the ape-man had disappeared. She shook as an aspen shakes in the breeze, shook in the mad tempest of her own passions. "If you will not come to me, you shall never go to another," she screamed, and then she turned and saw Commodore Florencil and Talaska running toward her. What followed occurred so quickly that it would be impossible to record the facts in the brief time that they actually consumed. It was over almost before Tarzan reached the bottom of the chute and picked himself from the earthen floor upon which he had been deposited. The room in which he found himself was lighted by several candles burning in iron-barred niches. Opposite him was a heavy gate of iron bars through which he could see another lighted apartment in which a man, his chin sagging dejectedly upon his breast, was seated upon a low bench. At the sound of Tarzan's precipitate entrance into the adjoining chamber, the man looked up and at sight of Xuanthrol, leapt to his feet. "Quick, to your left," he cried, and Tarzan, turning, saw two huge, green-eyed beasts crouching to spring. His first impulse was to rub his eyes as one might to erase the phantom figures of a disquieting dream, for what he saw were two ordinary African wild cats, ordinary in contour and markings, but in size gigantic. For an instant the ape-man forgot that he was but 1/4 his normal size, and that the cats that appeared to him as large as full-grown lions were in reality but average specimens of their kind. As they came toward him, he whipped out his sword, prepared to battle for his life with these great felines as he had so often before with their mighty cousins of his own jungle. "If you can hold them off until you reach this gate," cried the man in the next chamber, "I can let you through. The bolt is upon this side," but even as he spoke, one of the cats charged. Commodore Florencil, brushing past Janzara, leaped for the spot upon the floor at which Tarzan had disappeared, and as it gave beneath him, he heard a savage cry break from the lips of the Princess of Veltepesmachus. "So it is you he loves," she screamed. "But he shall not have you, no, not even in death," and that was all that Commodore Florencil heard as the black chute swallowed him. Talaskar, confronted by the infuriated Janzara, halted, and then stepped back, for the princess was rushing upon her with drawn dagger. "Die, slave," she screamed, as she lunged for the white breast of Talaskar, but the slave girl caught the other's wrist, and a moment later they went down, locked in one another's embrace. Together they rolled about the floor, the daughter of Elkamol Hago seeking to drive her slim blade into the breast of the slave girl, while Talaska fought to hold off the menacing steel and to close with her fingers upon the throat of her antagonist. As the first cat charged, the other followed, not to be robbed of its share of the flesh of the kill, for both were half-starved and ravenous, and as the ape-man met the charge of the first, sidestepping its rush and springing in again to thrust at its side, Commodore Florencil, who had drawn his sword as he entered the apartment of Janzara, shot into the subterranean den almost into the teeth of the second beast, which was so disconcerted by the sudden appearance of this second human that it wheeled and sprang to the far end of the den before it could gather its courage for another attack. In the chamber above, Talaskar and Janzara fought savagely, two she-tigers in human form. They rolled to and fro about the room, straining and striking Janzara, screaming, "Die, slave, you shall not have him." But Talaskar held her peace and saved her breath, so that slowly she was overcoming the other when they chanced to roll upon the very spot that had led Tarzan and Commodore Florencil to the pit beneath. As Janzara realized what had happened, she uttered a scream of terror. The cats, she cried, and then the two disappeared into the black shaft. Commodore Florencil did not follow the cat that had retreated to the far end of the pit, but sprang at once to Tarzan's aid, and together they drove off the first beast as they backed toward the gate, where the man in the adjoining chamber stood ready to admit them to the safety of his own apartment. The two cats charged and then retreated, springing in quickly and away again as quickly, for they had learned the taste of the sharp steel with which the humans were defending themselves. The two men were almost at the gate, another instant, and they could spring through. The cats charged again and again, were driven to the far corner of the pit. The man in the next chamber swung open the gate. "Quick," he cried, and at the same instant two figures shot from the mouth of the shaft and, locked tightly in one another's embrace, rolled to the floor of the pit directly in the path of the charging carnivores. Chapter 20. As Tarzan and Commodore Florencil realized that Talaskar and Janzara lay exposed to the savage assault of the hungry beasts, they both sprang quickly toward the two girls. As had been the case when Commodore Florencil had shot into the pit, the cats were startled by the sudden appearance of these two new humans, and in the first instant of their surprise had leaped again to the far end of the chamber. Janzara had lost her dagger as the two girls had fallen into the shaft, and now Talaska saw it lying on the floor beside her. Releasing her hold upon the princess, she seized the weapon and leapt to her feet. Already Tarzan and Commodore Florencil were at her side, and the cats were returning to the attack. Janzara rose slowly and half bewildered. She looked about, terror disfiguring her marvelous beauty, and as she did so the man in the adjoining chamber saw her. "Janzara," he cried. "My princess, I come," and seizing the bench upon which he had been sitting, and the only thing within the chamber that might be converted into a weapon, he swung wide the gate and leaped into the chamber where the four were now facing the thoroughly infuriated beasts. Both animals, bleeding from many wounds, were mad with pain, rage, and hunger. Screaming and growling, they threw themselves upon the swords of the two men who had pushed the girls behind them and were backing slowly toward the gate, and then the man with the bench joined Tarzan and Commodore Florencil, and the three fought back the charges of the infuriated carnivora. The bench proved fully as good a weapon of defense as the swords, and so together the five drew slowly back, until, quite suddenly, and without the slightest warning, both cats leaped quickly to one side and darted behind the party, as though sensing that the women would prove easier prey. One of them came near to closing upon Janzara had not the man with the bench, imbued apparently with demoniacal fury, leaped upon it with his strange weapon and beaten it back so desperately that it was forced to abandon the princess. Even then the man did not cease to follow it, but brandishing the bench, pursued it and its fellow with such terrifying cries and prodigious blows that, to escape him, both cats suddenly dodged into the chamber that the man had occupied. And before they could return to the attack, he with the bench had slammed the gate and fastened them upon its opposite side. Then he wheeled and faced the four. "Zoanthrohogo," cried the princess. "Your slave," replied the noble, dropping to one knee and leaning far back, with outstretched arms. "You have saved my life, Zoanthrogo," said Janzara, "and after all the indignities that I have heaped upon you, how can I reward you?" "I love you, princess, as you have long known," replied the man, "but now it is too late, for tomorrow I die by the king's will. Elkuma Hago has spoken, and even though you be his daughter, I do not hesitate to say his very ignorance prevents him ever changing a decision once reached." "I know," said Janzara, "he is my sire, but I love him not. He killed my mother in a fit of unreasoning jealousy. He is a fool, the fool of fools." Suddenly she turned upon the others. "These slaves would escape, Zoanthrogo," she cried. "With my aid they might accomplish it. With their company we might succeed in escaping too, and in finding an asylum in their own land." "If any one of them is of sufficient power in his native city," replied Zoanthrohogo. "This one," said Tarzan, seeing a miraculous opportunity for freedom, "is the son of Adendrahakis, king of Trahanadalmakis, the oldest son, and Zetalosto." Janzara looked at Tarzan a moment after he had done speaking. "I was wicked, Zoanthrol," she said, "but I thought that I wanted you, and being the daughter of a king I have seldom been denied aught that I craved, and then to Talaskar, take your man, my girl, and may you be happy with him." And she pushed Talaskar gently toward the ape-man, but Talaskar drew back. "You are mistaken, Janzara," she said. "I do not love Zoanthrol, nor does he love me." Commodore Florencil looked quickly at Tarzan as though expecting that he would quickly deny the truth of Talaskar's statement, but the ape-man only nodded his head in assent. "Do you mean," demanded Commodore Florencil, "that you do not love Talaskar?" And he looked straight into the eyes of his friend. "On the contrary, I love her very much," replied Tarzan, "but not in the way that you have believed, or should I say feared. I love her because she is a good girl, and a kind girl, and a loyal friend, and also because she was in trouble and needed the love and protection which you and I alone could give her, but as a man loves his mate. I do not love her, for I have a mate of my own in my country beyond the thorns." Commodore Florencil said no more, but he thought a great deal. He thought of what it would mean to return to his own city where he was the Zertalosto, and where, by all the customs of ages, he would be supposed to marry a princess from another city. But he did not want a princess, he wanted Talaskar, the little slave girl of Veltapismachus, who scarcely knew her own mother and most probably had never heard that of her father, if her mother knew it. He wanted Talaskar, but he could only have her in Trahanadalmakis as a slave. His love for her was real, and so he would not insult her by thinking such a thing as that. If he could not make her his princess, he would not have her at all, and so Commodore Florencil, the son of Adendrahakis, was sad. But he had none too much time to dwell upon his sorrow now, for the others were planning the best means for escape. The keepers come down to feed the cats upon this side, said Zoanthrogo, indicating a small door in the wall of the pit opposite, that which led into the chamber in which he had been incarcerated. Doubtless it is not locked, either, said Janzara, for a prisoner could not reach it without crossing through this chamber where the cats were kept. We will see, said Tarzan, and crossed to the door. A moment sufficed to force it open, revealing a narrow corridor beyond. One after another, the five crawled through the small aperture, and following the corridor ascended an acclivity, lighting their way with candles taken from the den of the carnivora. At the top a door opened into a wide corridor, a short distance down which stood a warrior, evidently on guard before a door. Janzara looked through the tiny crack that Tarzan had opened the door and saw the corridor and the man. Good, she exclaimed. It is my own corridor and the warrior is on guard before my door. I know him well. Through me he has escaped payment of his taxes for the past 30 moons. He would die for me. Come, we have nothing to fear. And stepping boldly into the corridor, she approached the sentry, the others following behind her. Until he recognized her, there was danger that the fellow would raise an alarm, but the moment he saw who it was, he was as wax in her hands. You are blind, she told him. If the Princess Janzara wishes it, he replied. She told him what she wished, 5 diadettes and some heavy warrior's wraps. He eyed those who were with her and evidently recognized Zoanthrogo and guessed who the 2 other men were. Not only shall I be blind for my princess, he said, but tomorrow I shall be dead for her. Fetch 6 diadettes, then, said the princess. Then she turned toward Como de Florencil. You are Prince Royal of Trohanadalmacus, she asked. I am, he replied. And if we show you the way to liberty, you will not enslave us. I shall take you to the city as my own slaves and then liberate you, he replied. It is something that has seldom, if ever, been done. She mused not in the memory of living man in Veltopusmachus. I wonder if your sire will permit it. The thing is not without precedent, replied Como de Florencil. It has been done but rarely, yet it has been done. I think you may feel assured of a friendly welcome at the court of Adendrahakis, where the wisdom of Zoanthroco will not go unappreciated or unrewarded. It was a long time before the warrior returned with the diadettes. His face was covered with perspiration and his hands with blood. I had to fight for them, he said, and we shall have to fight to use them if we do not hurry. Here, Prince, I brought you weapons, and he handed a sword and dagger to Zoanthrogo. They mounted quickly. It was Tarzan's first experience upon one of the wiry, active, little mounts of the Manunians, but he found the saddle well designed and the diadette easily controlled. They will be following me from the king's corridor, explained Orthark, the warrior who had fetched the diadettes. It would be best, then, to leave by one of the others. Trohanadalmacus is east of Veltopusmachus, said Zoanthrogo, and if we leave by the women's corridor with 2 slaves from Trohanadalmacus, they will assume that we are going there. But if we leave by another corridor, they will not be sure, and if they lose even a little time in starting the pursuit, it will give us just that much of an advantage. If we go straight toward Trohanadalmacus, we shall almost certainly be overtaken, as the swiftest of diadettes will be used in our pursuit. Our only hope lies in deceiving them as to our route or destination, and to accomplish this I believe that we should leave either by the warrior's corridor or the slave's corridor, cross the hills north of the city, circle far out to the north and east, not turning south until we are well past Trohanadalmacus. In this way we can approach that city from the east while our pursuers are patrolling the country west of Trohanadalmacus to Veltopusmachus. Let us leave by the warrior's corridor then, suggested Janzara. The trees and shrubbery will conceal us while we pass around to the north of the city, said Como de Florencil. We should leave at once, urged Orthark. Go first then with the princess, said Zoanthrogo, for there is a possibility that the guard at the entrance will let her pass with her party. We will muffle ourselves well with our warriors' cloaks. Come, lead the way. With Janzara and Orthark ahead and the others following closely, they moved at a steady trot along the circular corridor toward the warriors' corridor, and it was not until they had turned into the latter that any sign of pursuit developed. Even then, though they heard the voices of men behind them, they hesitated to break into a faster gait lest they arouse the suspicions of the warriors in the guard room, which they must pass near the mouth of the corridor. Never had the warriors' corridor seemed so long to any of the Veltopusmacusians in the party as it did this night. Never had they so wished to race their diadettes as now. but they held their mounts to an even pace that would never have suggested to the most suspicious that here were 6 people seeking escape, most of them from death. They had come almost to the exit when they were aware that the pursuit had turned into the warriors' corridor behind them and that their pursuers were advancing at a rapid gait. Janzara and Orathark drew up beside the sentry at the mouth of the corridor as he stepped out to bar their progress. The Princess Janzara, announced Orathark. Aside for the Princess Janzara. The princess threw back the hood of the warrior's cloak she wore, revealing her features well known to every warrior in the royal dome and well feared. The fellow hesitated. "Aside, man," cried the princess, "or I ride you down." A great shout arose behind them. Warriors on swiftly galloping diadetes leapt along the corridor toward them. The warriors were shouting something, the sense of which was hidden by the noise, but the sentry was suspicious. "Wait until I call the Novand of the guard, princess," he cried. "Something is amiss, and I dare let no one pass without authority, but wait. Here he is," and the party turned in their saddles to see a Novand emerging from the door of the guard room, followed by a number of warriors. "Ride," cried Janzara, and spurred her diadet straight for the single sentry in their path. The others lifted their mounts quickly in pursuit. The sentry went down, striking valiantly with his rapier at the legs and bellies of flying diadets. The Novand and his men rushed from the guard room just in time to collide with the pursuers, whom they immediately assumed were belated members of the fleeing party. The brief minutes that these fought, before explanations could be made and understood, gave the fugitives time to pass among the trees to the west side of the city, and turning north, make for the hills that were dimly visible in the light of a clear, but moonless night. Orathark, who said that he knew the hill trails perfectly, led the way, the others following as closely as they could, Comte de Florencil and Tarzan bringing up the rear. Thus they moved on in silence through the night, winding along precipitous mountain trails, leaping now and again from rock to rock where the trail itself had been able to find no footing, sliding into dank ravines, clambering through heavy brush and timber along tunnel-like trails that followed their windings, or crept up their opposite sides to narrow ridge or broad plateau, and all night long no sign of pursuit developed. Came the morning at last, and with it, from the summit of a lofty ridge, a panorama of broad plains stretching to the north, of distant hills, of forests, and of streams. They decided then to descend to one of the numerous park-like glades that they could see nestling in the hills below them, and arrest their mounts and permit them to feed, for the work of the night had been hard upon them. They knew that in the hills they might hide almost indefinitely, so wild and so little traveled were they, and so they went into camp an hour after sunrise in a tiny cup-like valley surrounded by great trees, and watered and fed their mounts with a sense of security greater than they had felt since they left Veltopismachus. Orathark went out on foot and killed a number of quail, and Tarzan speared a couple of fish in the stream. These they prepared and ate, and then, the men taking turns on guard, they slept until afternoon, for none had had sleep the night before. Taking up their flight again in mid-afternoon, they were well out upon the plain when darkness overtook them. Comte de Florencil and Zoanthrogo were riding far out upon the flanks, and all were searching for a suitable camping place. It was Zoanthrogo who found it, and when they all gathered about him, Tarzan saw nothing in the waning light of day that appeared any more like a good camping place than any other spot on the open plain. There was a little clump of trees, but they had passed many such clumps, and there was nothing about this one that seemed to offer any greater security than another. As a matter of fact, to Tarzan it appeared anything but a desirable campsite. There was no water, there was little shelter from the wind, and none from an enemy, but perhaps they were going into the trees. That would be better. He looked up at the lofty branches lovingly. How enormous these trees seemed. He knew them for what they were, and that they were trees of but average size, yet to him now they reared their heads aloft like veritable giants. "I will go in first," he heard Comte de Florencil say, and turned to learn what he referred to. The other 3 men were standing at the mouth of a large hole, into which they were looking. Tarzan knew that the opening was the mouth of the burrow of a ratel, the African member of the badger family, and he wondered why any of them wished to enter it. Tarzan had never cared for the flesh of the ratel. He stepped over and joined the others, and as he did so he saw Comte de Florencil crawl into the opening, his drawn sword in his hand. "Why is he doing that?" he asked Zoanthrogo. "To drive out, or kill the Kamban, if he is there," replied the prince, giving the ratel its Mununian name. "And why?" asked Tarzan. "Surely you do not eat its flesh?" "No, but we want his home for the night," replied Zoanthrogo. I had forgotten that you are not a minion. We will spend the night in the underground chambers of the Kamban, safe from the attacks of the cat or the lion. It would be better were we there now. This is a bad hour of the night for minions to be abroad on the plain or in the forest, for it is at this hour that the lion hunts. A few minutes later, Commodore Florenzel emerged from the hole. The Kamban is not there, he said. The burrow is deserted. I found only a snake, which I killed. Go in, or Athark and Janzara and Talaskar will follow you. You have candles. They had, and one by one they disappeared into the mouth of the hole, until Tarzan, who had asked to remain until last, stood alone in the gathering night, gazing at the mouth of the reptile's burrow, a smile upon his lips. It seemed ridiculous to him that Tarzan of the Apes should ever be contemplating hiding from Numa in the hole of a ratel, or worse still, hiding from little Scree, the wild cat, and as he stood there smiling, a bulk loomed dimly among the trees, the Diadet standing near, untethered. Snorted and leaped away, and Tarzan wheeled to face the largest lion he ever had seen, a lion that towered over twice the ape-man's height above him. How tremendous, how awe-inspiring Numa appeared to one the size of a Manunian. The lion crouched, its tail extended, the tip moving ever so gently, but the ape-man was not deceived. He guessed what was coming, and even as the great cat sprang, he turned and dove head foremost down the hole of the ratel, and behind him rattled the loose earth pushed into the burrow's mouth by Numa as he alighted upon the spot where Tarzan had stood. Chapter 21. For 3 days the six travelled toward the east, and then, upon the fourth, they turned south. A great forest loomed upon the distant southern horizon, sweeping also wide upon the east. To the southwest lay Trohanadal Mockus, a good 2 days' journey for their tired Diadets. Tarzan often wondered what rest the little creatures obtained. At night they were turned loose to graze, but his knowledge of the habits of the carnivora assured him that the tiny antelope must spend the greater part of each night in terrified watching, or in flight, yet every morning they were back at the camp awaiting the pleasure of their masters. That they did not escape, never to return, is doubtless due to 2 facts. One is that they have been for ages bred in the domes of the Manunians. They know no other life than with their masters, to whom they look for food and care, and the other is the extreme kindness and affection which the Manunians accord their beautiful beasts of burden, and which have won the love and confidence of the little animals to such an extent that the Diadet is most contented when in the company of man. It was during the afternoon of the 4th day of their flight that Talaskar suddenly called their attention to a small cloud of dust far to their rear. For a long time all 6 watched it intently as it increased in size and drew nearer. "It may be the long-awaited pursuit," said Zoanthrogo. "Or some of my own people from Trohanadol Mockus," suggested Commodore Florenzel. "Whoever they are, they greatly outnumber us," said Janzara, "and I think we should find shelter until we know their identity." "We can reach the forest before they overtake us," said Orathark, "and in the forest we may elude them if it is necessary." "I fear the forest," said Janzara. "We have no alternative," said Zoanthrogo, "but even now I doubt that we can reach it ahead of them. Come, we must be quick." Never before had Tarzan of the Apes covered ground so rapidly upon the back of an animal. The Diadets flew through the air in great bounds. Behind them the nucleus of the dust cloud had resolved itself into a dozen mounted warriors, against whom their 4 blades would be helpless. Their one hope, therefore, lay in reaching the forest ahead of their pursuers, and now it seemed that they would be successful, and now it seemed that they would not. The recently distant wood seemed rushing toward him as Tarzan watched ahead between the tiny horns of his graceful mount, and behind the enemy was gaining. They were Veltopus Macusian. They were close enough now for the devices upon their helmets to be seen, and they had recognized their quarry, for they cried aloud upon them to stop, calling several of them by name. One of the pursuers forged farther ahead than the others. He came now close behind Zoanthrogo, who rode neck and neck with Tarzan in the rear of their party. A half-length ahead of Zoanthrogo was Janzara. The fellow called aloud to her. "Princess," he cried, "the king's pardon for you all if you return the slaves to us. Surrender and all will be forgiven." Tarzan of the Apes heard, and he wondered what the Veltopus Macusians would do. It must have been a great temptation, and he knew it. Had it not been for Talaskar, he would have advised them to fall back among their friends, but he would not see the slave girl sacrificed. He drew his sword then, and dropped back beside Zoanthrogo, though the other never guessed his purpose. "Surrender, and all will be forgiven," shouted the pursuer again. "Never," cried Zoanthrogo. "Never," echoed Janzara. "The consequences are yours," cried the messenger, and on they rushed, pursuers and pursued, toward the dark forest, while from just within its rim savage eyes watched the mad race and red tongues licked hungry lips in anticipation. Tarzan had been glad to hear the reply given by both Suenthrohago and Janzara, whom he had found likable companions and good comrades. Janzara's whole attitude had changed since the very instant she had joined them in their attempted escape. No longer was she the spoiled daughter of a despot, but a woman seeking happiness through the new love that she had found, or the old love that she had but just discovered, for she often told Suenthrohago that she knew now that she always had loved him. And this new thing in her life made her more considerate and loving of others. She seemed now to be trying to make up to Talisker for the cruelty of her attack upon her when she had first seen her. Her mad infatuation for Tarzan she now knew in its true light, because she had been refused him she wanted him, and she would have taken him as her prince despite her father, whom she hated. Como de Florencil and Talisker always rode together, but no words of love did the Trohana Dalmacusian speak in the ear of the little slave girl. A great resolve was crystallizing in his mind, but it had as yet taken on no definite form. And Talisker, seemingly happy just to be near him, rode blissfully through the first days of the only freedom she had ever known, but now all was forgotten, except the instant danger of capture and its alternative concurrence, death and slavery. The six urged their straining mounts ahead. The forest was so near now. If they could but reach it. Their one warrior might be as good as three, and the odds against them would be reduced, for in the forest the whole 12 could not engage them at once, and by careful maneuvering they doubtless could separate them. They were going to succeed. A great shout rose to the lips of Orathark as his diadet leaped into the shadows of the first trees, and the others took it up for a brief instant, and then it died upon their lips as they saw a giant hand reach down and snatch Orathark from his saddle. They tried to stop and wheel their mounts, but it was too late. Already they were in the forest, and all about them was a horde of the hideous Zertalokolos. One by one they were snatched from their diadets, while their pursuers, who must have seen what was taking place just inside the forest, wheeled and galloped away. Talisker, writhing in the grip of a Shialali, turned toward Como de Florencil. "Goodbye," she cried. "This at last is the end, but I can die near you, and so I am happier dying than I have been living until you came to Veltopusmachus." "Goodbye, Talisker," he replied. "Living I dared not tell you, but dying I can proclaim my love. Tell me that you loved me." With all my heart, Como de Florencil, they seemed to have forgotten that another existed but themselves. In death they were alone with their love. Tarzan found himself in the hand of a male, and he also found himself wondering, even as he faced certain death, how it occurred that this great band of male and female Alali should be hunting together, and then he noticed the weapons of the males. They were not the crude bludgeon and the slinging stones that they had formerly carried, but long trim spears and bows and arrows. And now the creature that held him had lifted him even with his face and was scrutinizing him, and Tarzan saw a look of recognition and amazement cross the bestial features, and he, in turn, recognized his captor. It was the son of the first woman. Tarzan did not wait to learn the temper of his old acquaintance. Possibly their relations were altered now. Possibly they were not. He recalled the dog-like devotion of the creature when last he had seen him, and he put him to the test at once. "Put me down," he signed peremptorily, "and tell your people to put down all of my people. Harm them not." Instantly the great creature set Tarzan gently upon the ground and immediately signaled his fellows to do the same with their captives. The men did immediately as they were bid, and all of the women but one. She hesitated. The son of the first woman leapt toward her, his spear raised like a whip, and the female cowered and set Talisker down upon the ground. Very proud, the son of the first woman explained to Tarzan as best he could the great change that had come upon the Alali since the ape-man had given the men weapons, and the son of the first woman had discovered what a proper use of them would mean to the males of his kind. Now each male had a woman cooking for him, at least one, and some of them, the stronger, had more than one. To entertain Tarzan, and to show him what great strides civilization had taken in the land of the Zertalokolos, the son of the first woman seized a female by the hair and, dragging her to him, struck her heavily about the head and face with his clenched fist. And the woman fell upon her knees and fondled his legs, looking wistfully into his face, her own glowing with love and admiration. That night the six slept in the open, surrounded by the great Zertalokolos, and the next day they started across the plain toward Trohana Dalmacus, where Tarzan had resolved to remain until he regained his normal size. when he would make a determined effort to cut his way through the thorn forest to his own country. The Zertalakalols went a short distance out into the plain with them, and both men and women tried in their crude, savage way to show Tarzan their gratitude for the change that he had wrought among them and the new happiness he had given them. 2 days later, the 6 fugitives approached the domes of Trohanadalmakas. They had been seen by sentries when they were still a long way off, and a body of warriors rode forth to meet them, for it is always well to learn the nature of a visitor's business in Menuni before he gets too close to your home. When the warriors discovered that Commodore Florencil and Tarzan had returned, they shouted for joy, and a number of them galloped swiftly back to the city to spread the news. The fugitives were conducted at once to the throne room of Edendrohakis, and there that great ruler took his son in his arms and wept, so great was his happiness at having him returned safely to him. Nor did he forget Tarzan, though it was some time before he or the other Trohanadalamkushans could accustom themselves to the fact that this man, no bigger than they, was the great giant who had dwelt among them a few moons since. Edendrohakis called Tarzan to the foot of the throne, and there, before the nobles and warriors of Trohanadalmakas, he made him a Zertol, or prince, and he gave him diadetes and riches and allotted him quarters fitted to his rank, begging him to stay among them always. Janzara, Zoanthrohogo and Oratharki gave their liberty and permission to remain in Trohanadalmakas, and then Commodore Florencil drew Talaskar to the foot of the throne. "And now for myself I ask a boon, Edendrohakis," he said. "As Zertalosto I am bound by custom to wed a prisoner princess taken from another city, but in this slave girl have I found the one I love. Let me renounce my rights to the throne, and have her instead." Talaskar raised her hand as though to demur, but Commodore Florencil would not let her speak, and then Edendrohakis rose and descended the steps at the foot of which Talaskar stood, and taking her by the hand led her to a place beside the throne. "You are bound by custom only, Commodore Florencil," he said, "to wed a princess, but custom is not law. A Trohanadalmakusian may wed whom he pleases." "And even though he were bound by law," said Talaskar, "to wed a princess, still might he wed me, for I am the daughter of Talaskago, king of Mandalamakas. My mother was captured by the Veltapis Makusians but a few moons before my birth, which took place in the very chamber in which Commodore Florencil found me. She taught me to take my life before mating with anyone less than a prince. But I would have forgotten her teachings had Commodore Florencil been but the son of a slave. That he was the son of a king I did not dream until the night we left Veltapis Makas, and I had already given him my heart long before, though he did not know it." Weeks passed, and still no change came to Tarzan of the Apes. He was happy in his life with the Menunians, but he longed for his own people and the mate who would be grieving for him, and so he determined to set forth as he was, pass through the thorn forest and make his way toward home, trusting to chance that he might escape the countless dangers that would infest his way, and perhaps come to his normal size somewhere during the long journey. His friends sought to dissuade him, but he was determined, and at last, brooking no further delay, he set out toward the southeast in the direction that he thought lay the point where he had entered the land of the Menuni. A Kamak, a body consisting of 1,000 mounted warriors, accompanied him to the great forest, and there, after some days' delay, the son of the first woman found him. The Menunians bid him goodbye, and as he watched them ride away upon their graceful mounts, something rose in his throat that only came upon those few occasions in his life that Tarzan of the Apes knew the meaning of homesickness. The son of the first woman and his savage band escorted Tarzan to the edge of the thorn forest. Further than that they could not go. A moment later they saw him disappear among the thorns with a wave of farewell to them. For 2 days Tarzan, no larger than a Menunian, made his way through the thorn forest. He met small animals that were now large enough to be dangerous to him, but he met nothing that he could not cope with. By night he slept in the burrows of the larger burrowing animals. Birds and eggs formed his food supply. During the second night he awoke with a feeling of nausea suffusing him. A premonition of danger assailed him. It was dark as the grave in the burrow he had selected for the night. Suddenly the thought smote him that he might be about to pass through the ordeal of regaining his normal stature. To have this thing happen while he lay buried in this tiny burrow would mean death, for he would be crushed, strangled, or suffocated before he regained consciousness. Already he felt dizzy, as one might feel who was upon the verge of unconsciousness. He stumbled to his knees and clawed his way up the steep acclivity that led to the surface. Would he reach it in time? He stumbled on, and then suddenly a burst of fresh, night air smote his nostrils. He staggered to his feet. He was out, he was free. behind him, he heard a low growl. Grasping his sword, he lunged forward among the thorn trees. How far he went, or in what direction, he did not know. It was still dark when he stumbled and fell unconscious to the ground. Chapter 22. Waziri, returning from the village of Obi the cannibal, saw a bone lying beside the trail. This in itself was nothing remarkable. Many bones lie along savage trails in Africa, but this bone caused him to pause. It was the bone of a child. Nor was that alone enough to give pause to a warrior hastening through an unfriendly country back toward his own people. But Usula had heard strange tales in the village of Obi the cannibal, where rumor had brought him in search of his beloved master, the big Bwana. Obibi had seen nor heard nothing of Tarzan of the apes. Not for years had he seen the giant white. He assured Usula of this fact many times, but from other members of the tribe the Waziri learned that a white man had been kept a prisoner by Obibi for a year or more, and that some time since he had escaped. At first Usula thought this white man might have been Tarzan, but when he verified the statement of the time that had elapsed since the man was captured, he knew that it could not have been his master, and so he turned back along the trail toward home. But when he saw the child's bone along the trail several days out, he recalled the story of the missing Yaha, and he paused just for a moment to look at the bone. And as he looked, he saw something else, a small skin bag, lying among some more bones a few feet off the trail. Usula stooped and picked up the bag. He opened it and poured some of the contents into his palm. He knew what the things were, and he knew that they had belonged to his master, for Usula was a headman who knew much about his master's affairs. These were the diamonds that had been stolen from the big Bwana many moons before by the white men who had found Opar. He would take them back to the big Bwana's lady. 3 days later, as he moved silently along the trail close to the great thorn forest, he came suddenly to a halt, the hand grasping his heavy spear tensing in readiness. In a little open place he saw a man, an almost naked man, lying upon the ground. The man was alive. He saw him move, but what was he doing? Usula crept closer, making no noise. He moved around until he could observe the man from another angle, and then he saw a horrid sight. The man was white, and he lay beside the carcass of long-dead buffalo, greedily devouring the remnants of hide that clung to the bleaching bones. The man raised his head a little, and Usula, catching a better view of his face, gave a cry of horror. Then the man looked up and grinned. It was the big Bwana. Usula ran to him and raised him upon his knees, but the man only laughed and babbled like a child. At his side, caught over one of the horns of the buffalo, was the big Bwana's golden locket with the great diamonds set in it. Usula replaced it about the man's neck. He built a strong shelter for him nearby and hunted food, and for many days he remained until the man's strength came back, but his mind did not come back. And thus in this condition the faithful Usula led home his master. They found many wounds and bruises upon his body and his head, some old, some new, some trivial, some serious, and they sent to England for a great surgeon to come out to Africa and seek to mend the poor thing that once had been Tarzan of the apes. The dogs that had once loved Lord Greystoke slunk from this brainless creature. Jad Balja, the golden lion, growled when the man was wheeled near his cage. Korak, the killer, paced the floor in dumb despair, for his mother was on her way from England, and what would be the effect upon her of this awful blow? He hesitated even to contemplate it. Kamis, the witch doctor, had searched untiringly for Ahaha, his daughter, since the river devil had stolen her from the village of Obibi the cannibal. He had made pilgrimages to other villages, some of them remote from his own country, but he had found no trace of her or her abductor. He was returning from another fruitless search that had extended far to the east of the village of Obi, skirting the great thorn forest a few miles north of the Ugogo. It was early morning. He had but just broken his lonely camp and set out upon the last leg of his homeward journey when his keen old eyes discovered something lying at the edge of a small open space 100 yards to his right. He had just a glimpse of something that was not of the surrounding vegetation. He did not know what it was, but instinct bade him investigate. Moving cautiously nearer, he presently identified the thing as a human knee, just showing above the low grass that covered the clearing. He crept closer, and suddenly his eyes narrowed and his breath made a single, odd little sound as it sucked rapidly between his lips in mechanical reaction to surprise, for what he saw was the body of the river devil lying upon its back. One knee flexed the knee that he had seen above the grasses. His spear advanced, and ready he approached until he stood above the motionless body. Was the river devil dead, or was he asleep? Placing the point of his spear against the brown breast, Kamis prodded. The devil did not awaken. He was not asleep then. nor did he appear to be dead. Camis knelt and placed an ear above the other's heart. He was not dead. The witch doctor thought quickly. In his heart he did not believe in river devils, yet there was a chance that there might be such things, and perhaps this one was shamming unconsciousness, or temporarily absent from the flesh it assumed as a disguise that it might go among men without arousing suspicion. But too, it was the abductor of his daughter. That thought filled him with rage and with courage. He must force the truth from those lips, even though the creature were a devil. He unwound a bit of fiber rope from about his waist and, turning the body over upon its back, quickly bound the wrists behind it. Then he sat down beside it to wait. It was an hour before signs of returning consciousness appeared. Then the river devil opened his eyes. "Where is Aha, my daughter?" demanded the witch doctor. The river devil tried to free his arms, but they were too tightly bound. He made no reply to Camis' question. It was as though he had not heard it. He ceased struggling and lay back again, resting. After a while he opened his eyes once more and lay looking at Camis, but he did not speak. "Get up," commanded the witch doctor, and prodded him with a spear. The river devil rolled over on his side, flexed his right knee, raised on one elbow, and finally got to his feet. Camis prodded him in the direction of the trail. Toward dusk they arrived at the village of Obi. When the warriors and the women and the children saw who it was that Camis was bringing to the village, they became very much excited, and had it not been for the witch doctor of whom they were afraid, they would have knifed and stoned the prisoner to death before he was fairly inside the village gates. But Camis did not want the river devil killed, not yet. He wanted first to force from him the truth concerning Yehecha. So far he had been unable to get a word out of his prisoner. Incessant questioning, emphasized by many prods of the spear point, had elicited nothing. Camis threw his prisoner into the same hut from which the river devil had escaped, but he bound him securely and placed 2 warriors on guard. He had no mind to lose him again. Obibi came to see him. He too questioned him, but the river devil only looked blankly in the face of the chief. "I will make him speak," said Obibi. "After we have finished eating, we will have him out and make him speak. I know many ways." "You must not kill him," said the witch doctor. "He knows what became of Aha, and until he tells me, no one shall kill him." "He will speak before he dies," said Obibi. "He is a river devil and will never die," said Camis, reverting to the old controversy. "He is Tarzan," cried Obi, and the two were still arguing after they had passed out of hearing of the prisoner lying in the filth of the hut. After they had eaten, he saw them heating irons in a fire near the hut of the witch doctor, who was squatting before the entrance, working rapidly with numerous charms, bits of wood wrapped in leaves, pieces of stone, some pebbles, a zebra's tail. Villagers were congregating about Camis, until presently the prisoner could no longer see him. A little later a black boy came and spoke to his guards, and he was taken out and pushed roughly toward the hut of the witch doctor. Obi was there as he saw after the guards had opened a way through the throng, and he stood beside the fire in the center of the circle. It was only a small fire, just enough to keep a couple of irons hot. "Where is Aha, my daughter?" demanded Camis. The river devil did not answer. Not once had he spoken since Camis had captured him. "Burn out one of his eyes," said Obibi. "That will make him speak." "Cut out his tongue," screamed a woman. "Cut out his tongue." "Then he cannot speak at all, you fool," cried Camis. The witch doctor arose and put the question again, but received no reply. Then he struck the river devil a heavy blow in the face. Camis had lost his temper, so that he did not fear even a river devil. "You will answer me now," he screamed, and stooping he seized a red-hot iron. "The right eye first," shrilled Obibi. The doctor came to the bungalow of the ape-man. Lady Greystoke brought him with her. They were 3 tired and dusty travellers as they dismounted at last before the rose-embowered entrance, the famous London surgeon, Lady Greystoke, and Flora Hawkes, her maid. The surgeon and Lady Greystoke went immediately to the room where Tarzan sat in an improvised wheelchair. He looked up at them blankly as they entered. "Don't you know me, John?" asked the woman. Her son took her by the shoulders and led her away, weeping. "He does not know any of us," he said. "Wait until after the operation, mother, before you see him again. You can do him no good, and to see him this way is too hard upon you." The great surgeon made his examination. There was pressure on the brain from a recent fracture of the skull. An operation would relieve the pressure and might restore the patient's mind and memory. It was worth attempting. Nurses and 2 doctors from Nairobi, engaged the day they arrived there, followed Lady Greystoke and the London surgeon, reaching the bungalow the day after their arrival. The operation took place the following morning. Lady Greystoke, Korak and Miriam were awaiting, in an adjoining room, the verdict of the surgeon. Was the operation a failure or a success? They sat mutely staring at the door leading into the improvised operating room. At last it opened, after what seemed ages, but was only perhaps an hour. The surgeon entered the room where they sat. Their eyes, dumbly pleading, asked him the question that their lips dared not voice. "I cannot tell you anything as yet," he said, "other than that the operation as an operation was successful. What the result of it will be only time will tell. I have given orders that no one is to enter his room, other than the nurses. For 10 days they are instructed not to speak to him or allow him to speak for the same length of time, but he will not wish to speak, for I shall keep him in a semi-conscious condition by means of drugs, until the 10 days have elapsed. Until then, Lady Greystoke, we may only hope for the best. But I can assure you that your husband has every chance for complete recovery. I think you may safely hope for the best." The witch doctor laid his left hand upon the shoulder of the river devil, and his right hand was clutched a red-hot iron. "The right eye first," shrilled Obibi. Suddenly the muscles upon the back and shoulders of the prisoner leaped into action, rolling beneath his brown hide. For just an instant he appeared to exert terrific physical force. There was a snapping sound at his back as the strands about his wrists parted, and an instant later steel-thewed fingers fell upon the right wrist of the witch doctor. Blazing eyes burned into his. He dropped the red-hot rod, his fingers paralyzed by the pressure upon his wrist, and he screamed, for he saw death in the angry face of the god. Obib leaped to his feet. Warriors pressed forward, but not near enough to be within reach of the river devil. They had never been certain of the safety of tempting Providence in any such manner as Khamis and Obibi had been about to do. Now here was the result. The wrath of the river devil would fall upon them all. They fell back, some of them, and that was a cue for others to fall back. In the minds of all was the same thought: if I have no hand in this, the river devil will not be angry with me. Then they turned and fled to their huts, stumbling over their women and their children who were trying to outdistance their lords and masters. Obibi turned now to flee also, and the river devil picked Khamis up and held him in 2 hands high above his head and ran after Obibi the chief. The latter dodged into his own hut. He had scarce reached the center of it when there came a terrific crash upon the light, thatched roof, which gave way beneath a heavy weight. A body descending upon the chief filled him with terror. The river devil had leaped in through the roof of his hut to destroy him. The instinct of self-preservation rose momentarily above his fear of the supernatural, for now he was convinced that Khamis had been right and the creature they had so long held prisoner was indeed the river devil. And Obibi drew the knife at his side and lunged it again and again into the body of the creature that had leaped upon him, and when he knew that life was extinct he rose and, dragging the body after him, stepped out of his hut into the light of the moon and the fires. "Come, my people," he cried, "you have nothing to fear, for I, Obibi, your chief, have slain the river devil with my own hands." And then he looked down at the thing trailing behind him and gave a gasp and sat down suddenly in the dirt of the village street, for the body at his heels was that of Khamis, the witch doctor. His people came, and when they saw what had happened they said nothing but looked terrified. Obi examined his hut and the ground around it. He took several warriors and searched the village. The stranger had departed. He went to the gates. They were closed, but in the dust before them was the imprint of naked feet, the naked feet of a white man. Then he came back to his hut, where his frightened people stood waiting him. Obi was right, he said. The creature was not the river devil, it was Tarzan of the apes, for only he could hurl Khamis so high above his head that he would fall through the roof of a hut, and only he could pass unaided over our gates. The 10th day had come. The great surgeon was still at the Greystoke bungalow awaiting the outcome of the operation. The patient was slowly emerging from under the influence of the last dose of drugs that had been given him during the preceding night, but he was regaining his consciousness more slowly than the surgeon had hoped. The long hours dragged by, morning ran into afternoon, and evening came, and still there was no word from the sick room. It was dark. The lamps were lighted. The family were congregated in the big living room. Suddenly the door opened and a nurse appeared. Behind her was the patient. There was a puzzled look upon his face, but the face of the nurse was wreathed in smiles. The surgeon came behind, assisting the man who was weak from long inactivity. "I think Lord Greystoke will recover rapidly now," he said. "There are many things that you may have to tell him. He did not know who he was when he regained consciousness, but that is not unusual in such cases." The patient took a few steps into the room, looking wonderingly about. "There is your wife, Greystoke," said the surgeon kindly. Lady Greystoke rose and crossed the room toward her husband, her arms outstretched. A smile crossed the face of the invalid as he stepped forward to meet her and take her in his arms, but suddenly someone was between them, holding them apart. It was Flora Hawkes. "My God, Lady Greystoke," she cried. "He ain't your husband. It's Miranda, Esteban Miranda. Don't you suppose I'd know him in a million? I ain't seen him since we came back, never having been in the sick chamber, but I suspicioned something the minute he stepped into this room, and when he smiled I knew." "Flora," cried the distracted wife. "Are you sure?" No, you must be wrong. God has not given me back my husband only to steal him away again. John, tell me, is it you? You would not lie to me." For a moment the man before them was silent. He swayed to and fro, as in weakness. The surgeon stepped forward and supported him. "I have been very sick," he said. "Possibly I have changed, but I am Lord Greystoke. I do not remember this woman," and he indicated Flora Hawkes. "He lies," cried the girl. "Yes, he lies," said a quiet voice behind them, and they all turned to see the figure of a giant white standing in the open French windows leading to the veranda. "John," cried Lady Greystoke, running toward him, "how could I have been mistaken?" But the rest of the sentence was lost as Tarzan of the Apes sprang into the room and, taking his mate in his arms, covered her lips with kisses. The end. Best audiobooks for free. Hope that you have enjoyed this production of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan and the Ant-Men. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content.